Welcome to this video lecture for the textbook Understanding Project Management, a Practical Guide, second edition. This is Chapter 6, Budget Planning. Just a review of the project life cycle. We are well in our way, or on our way, into planning, and this topic for this video is budget planning. Just as a reminder, as I've talked about previously, the planning functions, all of these different topics of planning are intertwined with each other. So as we consider the budget, we also may be affecting the planning of scope, the planning of schedule, the team, quality, risk, and so on. So this is very interconnected. Budget planning is also extremely important and visible to key project stakeholders, particularly the project sponsor. Project sponsors and other stakeholders tend to be very focused and pay attention to many aspects of the project, but particularly around the budget. It is the cost of the project. There is a limited budget normally available, and it affects the profitability or the budgets of the organization. So it's extremely important. So budget planning for a project manager is extremely important. That's what we're going to be looking at in this video. So on our agenda, or for our agenda today, there's two main questions which we will ask. One is, how much will the project cost? That is a key question. That's an unknown at the start of the project. As you recall, we have an overall budget defined in the project charter, but just the mere mention of an amount in a charter does not make that the project cost. That's perhaps the amount that's been budgeted. That's the amount available, but it may not be what the project will actually do based on the scope defined and other factors. So this is part of what we're doing in budget planning, is defining how much the project will cost, or it will be planned to cost. And then the next is, when will the project costs occur? So are they evenly distributed over the span of the entire project, or are they more towards the front of the project, or more towards the end of the project, or something in between? That's a key question that needs to be answered and planned for during the budget planning processes. So let's look at how much the project will cost, or will be planned to cost. As I just mentioned, recall that during the initiating phase, the overall budget for the project was documented in the project charter. So we're now in this phase, in the planning phase, we're going to examine that to refine this amount and possibly re-estimate it to make sure that the scope and schedule and the quality, everything that we are planning for, will meet that overall budget that's been defined in the project charter. And if it doesn't, that becomes an issue that we need to resolve. Now, costs can be of various types, and it really depends upon the project, the organization, and so on, as to which costs the project are going to include within its budget and what it's tracking. So costs may be direct or indirect. Direct costs are costs that are directly caused by the project and normally are tracked by the project in terms of its budget. Things like the cost of the people working on the project in terms of their salary or hourly rates, materials that are consumed by the project. If there was wood or lumber or some kind of materials that were consumed during the project, then those would be direct costs. Indirect costs, on the other hand, are costs that are incurred but are less immediately obvious. For example, the rent for the building that the project team works in is theoretically a cost that the project is using, but it's indirect. There needs that is something that is there. Some projects will charge those to the project, and that'll be tracked some portion of the building rent, and some may not. So it really depends upon the organization. Another example of indirect costs are perhaps the laptop or computer equipment that the project team is using. They aren't completely bought and used for that project. They are ongoing for many, many projects, but sometimes those indirect costs, that monthly charge perhaps for those laptop and other technical equipment, can be charged to the project as indirect costs. So it really depends upon the project and the organization. But those are two major categories of costs. Now, estimating costs is a very challenging thing. Any kind of estimating is challenging, whether it is estimating the duration of how long an activity will take, or the project end date, or other estimates. How long something's going to take to do are difficult. Estimating costs is also difficult and also challenging, but it's something that needs to be done during budget planning. Without estimation, there would be no budget planning. There would be no costs. We would only say to our stakeholders, well, I don't know, we'll see what it costs when it's done. And that's not something that you can say, that you should say to your project sponsor. So you need to estimate somehow. So what are some of the ways of doing that? Well, there is a type of estimating called analogous estimating. And that means that analogous, the root word there is analogy, which is to compare it to something else. And normally during analogous estimating, we compare it to perhaps a previous project that we or our organization did, or somebody we know, or some project we know that is similar in some ways to this project. And then what we can do is say, okay, well, if that project, which is kind of like the one we're doing, cost X, then our project, all things being equal, will be somewhat similar to X. Might be a little bit more, might be a little bit less, depending upon any differences that might exist between them. But it's a way we can compare back to a previous project. It's really is benefiting from the experience of past work, and then help us to come up with an estimate of costs. Now, that's one way. There's another way, which is called parametric estimating. And now this is something that is not always possible, but sometimes very useful. There are sometimes unit costs that are defined, and a known cost of 1 unit of some kind of work or output. And then if our project is able to define the number of units that we need, or that we're going to use or do, it's a way for us then to extrapolate the expected costs. Let me give you an example. For anyone who's planned or has or will plan a banquet or dinner, one of the costs that you need to predict is the cost of the food. Now, if you contact caterers and you say, okay, I want this type of food and this type of dessert and so on, they'll be able to provide you a cost per unit. And it's within the catering business, it's called a plate, like a plate of food for one person. So then all you need to do, or what you need to do, is if you can say how many people you expect to come to your banquet or dinner, you're then able to extrapolate the costs. For example, if it was $100 per plate of food, and you had, 10 people coming to this, it would be $100 times 10 would be the cost, or $1,000. That would be the way of doing that. There are other examples of parametric estimating. For example, much of the building industry uses parametric estimating, such as if you're installing carpet or so on, and you go to a home renovation store, they might say, okay, this carpet or flooring is $5 per square foot for the materials. And so what you need to do then is to calculate the number of square feet you have to do, plus a little bit of extra wastage and so on. There's cuts and a little extra you'll need, and then multiply that by $5, and that gives you your estimated cost for those materials. So it's a way of doing that. In the software industry, there are kind of known or estimated costs per line of computer code that's written. So it can be a certain number of a certain amount of money per line of code. And then if you can instead of trying to predict the cost, you can determine, well, the number of lines of code that you think you're going to need for a certain system, then you can come up with a parametric estimate. So that is a way of estimating. Finally, another is bottom-up estimating. And this is the most detailed way of estimating, and it really requires your work breakdown structure to be completed. It's one of the reasons why, and during our chapter on scope planning, I mentioned that the work breakdown structure is such an important document, because in budget planning, we then, instead of trying to come up with an overall estimate for the entire project, like analogous and to some extent parametric tends to do, we then estimate each of the work packages, each of the smaller amounts of work, which are easier to estimate than the entire project. And then what you do is you add up all of the estimated costs of each work package, and you add that all up, and it becomes your estimate for the entire project. And that's why it's called bottom up. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages of each of these different types. They have strengths and weaknesses. And so as a discussion, or for something for you to think about, is what are the advantages and disadvantages of each estimating approach? So I encourage you to think about that and to check the chapter 6 within the textbook, which will talk about each of these estimating techniques in more detail, as well as go through the advantages and disadvantages of each. Now, one note, you don't have to choose just one of these during budget planning. It can be an all-in approach where you do a little of each in many cases. So you can do a little, some initial analogous, parametric where you can, and bottom up as a final estimate, and so on later on in planning. So this is an all-in approach. Okay, as usual, we're going to look at our ongoing case study video. And what we're going to see now is what happens during the DECO CAM project, and to see what Sophie, the project manager, is going to do with regard to creating the project estimates. So we'll watch this together. For Sophie, creating the cost estimates is the trickiest part of the business. From past experience, she has learned that estimating too high can cause projects to be cancelled, but estimating too low can mean she will exceed her cost later. A guesstimate is simply not good enough. This time, Sophie feels confident. Thanks to her earlier work brainstorming and categorizing the work packages, she can now better assess the estimated cost of each work package, and therefore the overall project. Sophie decides that to perform this task, a change of scenery is in order. On the way to work, she pulls into the parking lot of her local coffee shop. After ordering a large coffee, she opens her laptop and looks at the project schedule. The majority of the cost for this project will come from the people working on the project in the form of their salaries. At Deco Productions, the finance department has calculated what is known as a loaded rate for employees working on projects. This loaded rate is an hourly rate that includes not only their salaries, but also reflects overhead costs, such as benefits, building costs, and office supplies. So far, 2 people have been assigned to the project, Sophie and Fatijit Kumar. While other team members have not yet been assigned to the project, based on the work involved, Sophie knows she will need the following resources. She considers the amount of work that will be required for each activity. For some activities, she uses her in-depth knowledge of the work involved, while for others, she considers past projects. She makes a quick call to one of the company's graphic designers to verify her estimates for the graphics-related work. Sophie also includes the cost of her own time and that of Fatijit, which she predicts will be spent during the executing phase. During the 5 weeks of execution, she estimates that about 1/3 of her time will be needed to manage the team, resolve issues, and communicate with the project stakeholders. She also estimates that she will need about 1 day per week of Fatijit's time to answer the project team's questions about the project scope and provide quality control for the completed deliverables. Next, Sophie creates a list that contains the amount of materials and equipment that the project will need. As she records this information, she checks the current price of each item listed on a number of suppliers' websites. Finally, she considers any additional costs that may be incurred during the project. 1 hour, 1 large coffee, and 2 maple donuts later, Sophie has settled on a total cost estimate for the project and heads into work. Okay, so we saw in that video a number of things that the project manager, Sophie, was doing. So this is all part of creating the cost estimates. Now, you noticed that Sophie primarily used a bottom-up approach to estimating the project cost, though there was mention that she considered past projects as well. So you could see some analogous estimating was creeping in there somewhat. The video talked about a loaded rate. And that's something that, again, the textbook will describe more information about that. But that's an example. That's something that many organizations will do. And this is regarding normally of the human resources costs. They will, instead of just considering the hourly, salary costs or hourly rate of the project team member, working on the project, they'll also build in some indirect costs into that to say, well, the cost of someone working on a project is not just exactly what we pay them, what the organization pays them, but also there's a percentage for their benefits if they have them, the building costs, the insurance on the building, the equipment costs, all of those things, the cost of the security to, keep the building safe and so on. So there's all kinds of costs that are built in. So that's called a loaded rate. And again, it depends on the organization and the project as to whether just the straight salary costs are used for human resources or if a loaded rate is used. And the finance area of the organization will usually advise and make decisions about that. Sophie considers both the human resources costs and other costs, materials, equipment, and so on. On the DecoCam project, the majority of the costs are the cost of the human resources, the people working on it. But that's not always the case. Some projects are the reverse, where the materials and equipment are the majority of the costs and so on. So every project's a little different in that regard. Now, she came up with a total estimate. She considered all the work that was done, all of the materials, and so you can see that to do cost estimating, we really need to know a fair bit about the scope of the project in order to know what we're going to do. So cost estimating really requires that scope to be done to some extent in order to be able to develop reasonable costs. Her total estimate for the DecoCam version 4 product launch is $56,520, which just happens to be, or where we are is $3,480 under the total budget of $60,000 defined in the project's charter, which is good. I mean, it's good to be a little under that end of that. We have a little bit of room if costs wind up being higher during the executing phase. If it was over. Now, the other thing that could have occurred at this point is that Sophie did all her work and it came to $64,000, let's say, which would be $4,000 over our budget. Well, if that was the case, she would need to immediately talk to her project sponsor and say, okay, Arun, what are we going to do in this case? What's our approach? Should we? Is there more budget to include for the product launch, or should we look at ways of reducing costs, which may be less scope? Maybe we can defer something to another project. Maybe some of the materials we were going to buy, maybe there's a different type that is that would save us some money. So that's where then we would make some different scope decisions or timing decisions, which could allow us to get down to our $60,000 budget or below it. But at this point we are under budget. Now, as a discussion item, there's a question of, well, what is this $3,480 known as, this amount that we're under? And that's something you can find in the textbook. It is known as the budget contingency. It's the amount extra that you have. Now, what I suggest here is to check Chapter 6 to see the cost estimates that were performed. They're on page 90 and 91. You can see that it's very detailed, that there's lots of costs that Sophie is considering. And you could see that in the video. You could see where she was estimating how much of her time and Fattigit's time was going to be required. She considers all of the different different activities that will be performed and what the expected cost will be as a result of people working on it, as well as the materials that will need to be purchased. You can see that she was looking up the costs on supplier websites and so on, and coming up with basically a big spreadsheet, which contains all of the expected costs that come out to $56,520. So have a look at that in the textbook in detail. Make sure that you understand that. So as a key idea, develop cost estimates for the human resources, materials, equipment, and any other requirements that may be there. Okay, the next major question is, when will the project costs occur? It's not enough just to know the amount of the expected costs, but we also need to know when are they expected to occur. So the cost information contained in the cost estimates document is combined with the schedule information. Now, again, whereas previously for the estimates, we were more concerned with the scope, with the work breakdown structure, now we're starting to bring in the schedule and say, well, when are we going to be doing various activities, which will help us determine the timing of the costs. And the document that this will result in is called the detailed budget. Now, again, we will watch our next installment of the case study video, and we're going to see how the detailed budget is put together by Sophie, the project manager. Sophie reviews the total cost estimate of the project, She is relieved that it is less than the $60,000 budget, giving her a small contingency fund. However, she also knows from experience that costs often are higher than estimated and that they will need to be managed closely throughout the project. To do so, in addition to the amount of estimated costs, she will need to know when they are planned to occur. For example, if $30,000 is spent by the halfway point of the project, does this mean the project will meet its budget? What if more of the costs will be incurred near the end of the project? This could indicate that the project will be over budget. Opening her laptop, Sophie creates a spreadsheet. For each row, she lists an activity of the project. For each column, she lists a week of the project. Sophie focuses first on the human resources costs. Using the project schedule and the planned costs that were contained in the detailed estimates, she begins to fill in the cells of the spreadsheet. For example, for the week ending March 27th, her calculations would be as follows. The Initiate the Project activity is planned to start and finish in 3 days. Sophie plans to spend 50% of her time on this activity. Because her daily rate is $800, this results in a total plan cost of $1,200. This amount is placed under the March 27th column. The first 2 days of the Plan the Project activity are also planned to start during this week. There are 2 resources assigned to this activity, 50% of the project manager's time and 100% of the business analyst's time. This results in a total plan cost of $2,080. Sophie continues to calculate the planned cost for each of the remaining 7 weeks of the project schedule. Next, she considers the other non-HR costs and determines when these costs will likely occur. Based on the schedule, the banner stands will be ordered during the week ending April 10th, the cards during the week ending April 17th, and the cameras and tripods during the week ending April 24th. Material costs for the murals will occur during the week ending April 17th. Sophie inserts a row for each of these. Once complete, she double-checks her work to ensure that the total cost in her new spreadsheet, $56,520, matches the total of the cost estimates she developed earlier. Once the planned costs for all weeks are calculated, the detailed budget is complete. Okay, so we saw there Sophie, the project manager, working on the detailed budget. And you could see that it is a fairly rigorous task to do it. There's lots and lots of information that needs to be considered, timing. It really relies on the project schedule primarily in terms of the timing and the amount of effort that's going to be taken within each. And so this allows the project manager to develop the detailed budget. Now, Sophie decides to organize the detailed budget by project phase, and then within each phase lists the human resources costs and the other costs. So she's splitting it out by each. There's various approaches that can be taken to developing a budget. In this case, this made sense for her project. So using the cost estimates that already developed and the project schedule, she calculates the planned costs for each week. And we could see that in the video where she was looking at an activity and then going to her schedule and seeing when it was going to occur and then how much, time was going to be taken by the resources, looked at their loaded rate, and then calculated an amount. This is the hard work of doing a budget, of really a detailed budget, of doing that in order to develop the overall expected costs. Now, again, see chapter 6 in the textbook for the completed detailed budget, and you'll see that on page 94 and 95 of chapter 6, and you can see the level of detail that goes into this detailed budget. This is the expected costs that are expected to occur during the project. So there's a lot of work involved. The level of detail in the detailed budget, i.e. the breakdown of costs, and the number of time periods depend on the project. So there are some projects where there is much very finely detailed costs, and there are some that are perhaps a little more higher level. It can be a number of factors, such as the amount of budget, the finance requirements of your project, and so on. We'll go into that. Projects with higher budgets often require a more detailed breakdown of costs than smaller, simpler projects. And that should make sense. If you're dealing in, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, there may be a higher level of accounting needed than on a small, simple project that is spending a very, very small amount of budget. So it can vary. The duration of the time periods usually depends on the overall duration of the project. Very long projects may have monthly or even quarterly time periods, versus shorter projects, in this case for this the DecoCam product launch project is fairly short. It has weekly time periods. So the duration of the time periods, the columns in the detailed budget, can vary depending on the overall duration of the project. And you can see that in the textbook, whereas the first version on page 94 provides a weekly time periods. Another version of it, which is the exact same detailed budget, is on page 96 and 97, and it shows the monthly costs. But it's the same numbers, just shown in monthly time periods versus weekly time periods. And that's, again, a decision based upon the needs of the financial needs of the company, the project sponsor, and so on. That's something that the project manager would determine is the level of detail required in the project, in the detailed budget itself. Another question is, well, what are the advantages of creating a detailed budget? And that's something that you should think about. And the textbook will provide more information on that. But it's something that's really important. And just as a hint here is that one of the things that needs to be done, especially during the executing phase, is to manage the budget, is to monitor it and see how we're doing. If we don't have a detailed budget, if we don't know the expected timing of our costs, it is very difficult to know how we're doing, because otherwise you'll just be in the executing phase and you'll have spent some amount of money and you won't know if that's good or bad. Are we ahead or behind? A detailed budget allows you to manage your budget much more effectively. So that's one key advantage, but check the textbook for more information about that. Again, key idea is to create a detailed budget that shows the distribution of estimated costs over the timeline of the project. So if you do these two things, if you develop effective, as accurate a cost estimates as you can, and you create a detailed budget as effectively as you can with as much detail and information that you can determine, this will allow you to more effectively manage the project budget, your project budget, throughout the project. In terms of key terminology, some new terms that were included: analogous estimating, bottom-up, budget contingency, detailed budget, and parametric estimate. Again, see Chapter 6, key terminology, for a complete list of key terms and definitions and some of the references. This is the end of this video lecture for budget planning.